This is Penny from Wisconsin Land and Water, and thank you for joining us today for Is the Use of Land Economically Sustainable? And our presenter is Jim Munch, and I am excited to hear this presentation. It should be very interesting. I see Jim is there. Are you ready to go, Jim?
I am.
Okay, let's take it away.
I'm just going to skip over introductions. Some of you were sent an article that just appeared that really examined everything here except the fuzz in my belly button. This is a picture of our farm. To pick up on that article, or for those who didn't see the article, we do raise grass-fed beef near Coon Valley, Wisconsin. Coon Valley, Wisconsin is near La Crosse in the southwest part of the state. Today we're going to talk about a survey I did that looked at this question. Is this sort of land, if we use it as to raise grass-fed beef, is it economically sustainable? But before we do, we have a lot of land conservation people on the line because Penny's operation sponsored this. So let's go back to what this is all about from a conservation standpoint, and look at some data about land use in Wisconsin. I'm taking the USDA farm census information from 2007 to 2017. We have gained in Wisconsin 700,000 acres of corn and beans, and we have lost 9,000 acres of hay and pasture. Notably, we lost 300,000 acres of pasture in Wisconsin. About 250, someplace between 215 and 250,000 acres have been taken out of farmland use altogether. What has caused this? Everybody knows this that's in the business, but it's the loss of small dairy businesses. And I use the word businesses advisedly. People are still sitting on that land in many cases, but they're just out of the dairy business. The other thing that changed this rather dramatically was in 2000, as we all know, is in 2010, 2012, there was a big run up in grain prices, and it was enough to flip a lot of people out of animal agriculture into grain production. Another thing that facilitated this was the ease of entry into row crop production. Farmers that had been dairy farmers had the equipment to do this, and anybody that had the investment to buy large row crop equipment could easily rent land from neighbors, and it was easy for the neighbor to rent that land. Also, concurrent with all of this is the government insurance program was altered to make grain production even less risky than it was with government programs of the past. And unfortunately, this development land, this 250,000 acres of development land, took a lot of the quote best land out of the equation, thus forcing a lot of grain production onto land that arguably probably shouldn't have been in grain production. And then we did have a generational shift with people going off the farm and now owning farms because their parents died or whatever reason. We lost a bit of conservation ethic, although I see this coming back in my area in spades as we do these watershed development programs. And what has that done in visual form, in actual tangible form? It is this field that you see here used to be either a pasture or a hay field. It was fallow. Right before they rented more of their land, every acre up there on that hillside could make the owner some money. And you'll see, I joke the land is weeping. You can see the weeping on this land. So that is one thing that has happened. The other thing that has happened is that people that said they were going to use no-till operations were challenged exactly how to do that. Some would say they didn't care, but I think more it's that they were just challenged at the concept. So here's an example of a waterway that was designed to be too narrow, and once in a while somebody from the co-op burned it down inadvertently. It was not designed correctly, it was not maintained, and there's no repair to the damage that you can see here. So what this resulted in was, okay, we can't drive across these ditches, so we'll plant at right angles parallel to the ditches. We'll plant at right angles to the contour of the land because it's easier. And that made more channels for water to flow downhill, take soil with it. The other thing that they were challenged and continue to be challenged with is this idea of leaving trash on the ground. And when you don't leave trash on the ground in a hilly place like we have, and the hills that you saw in that field I took a picture of were probably 6 to 12. That's a D slope field for those of you who are into soils. If you don't leave enough trash, erosion will start, especially with these horrible rains we've been having. That starts, sheet erosion transitions to real erosion. Real erosion translates to gully erosion, and there you've filled up Coon Creek, there you've filled up the Kickapoo and eventually the Mississippi with phosphorus and soil. So anyway, this is a very personal thing to me because this is my neighborhood, and I live a mile and a half as the crow flies from the very first CCC camp that was installed by what was then the Soil Conservation Service. And they saved all this land back in the 30s. And now we're reversing that. So it's a sad thing. So one of the conclusions you draw from this, just by observation, you don't have to be a scientist, is that land use decisions drive conservation outcomes. Soil loss, phosphorus and nitrogen, phosphorus going into the streams, nitrogen going into the water table out of which we drink, rain runoff resulting in flooding. Coon Valley 2 years ago, bull in the middle of the street, shown throughout the United States. And this type, we have lost carbon in this whole process through the loss of organic matter. So just for the heck of it, I took our farm, which is 1992, and we've managed intensive grazing since the 90s. I took our farm, which is C slope, D slope, some E slope. The majority of it is D slope. D slope is what, 12 to 20% slope, let's say 15 for giggles. I ran it through a version of Russell II that the university has provided us to do some work on a watershed. And Russell II would predict that on our farm, we would lose in a normal year 0.05 tons per acre of soil. If I said, okay, we're going to get out of this business and go to real, honest to God, no-till with wide waterways, really good no-till, we'd lose 1.5 acres according to Russell II. T, which is this mythical tolerable rate of loss, is 5 tons per acre. If we did grain and just did one spring cultivation activity, we'd jump to almost 10 tons per acre of loss. And unfortunately, some of the people doing no-till do a spring cultivation occasionally because they want to get rid of this nasty trash. And so they're probably up in the 10 tons per acre. So the background, however, should be that soil can form no quicker under natural conditions than 0.2 to 0.8 tons per year. So all of the land use is a challenge, except grazing on this farm with the slopes we have and with the silt loam soils. All of that was theoretical. The University of Wisconsin runs the Discovery Farm system where they actually measure this stuff. And so on the Breneman farm, I got this slide from Laura Payne, famous in the pasture world, grazing world in Wisconsin, and once an extension agent down where Gene Schriefer, I think where Gene Schriefer is now, or no, maybe not, maybe in another county. This comes from the Breneman Discovery Farm, and they actually measured soil loss from pasture where they had actually outwintered cattle. They measured, so in 2006, 0.9 tons per acre, so small it doesn't show up on the graph. In 2007, you can see the number. Russell 2 would have predicted 0.04. The actual outcome on dairy cropping system with 3 years of cover up with hay was 0.86 tons per acre, and row crop system on that same farm was 2.78. You can see it's a reasonably sloping farm, probably in that 6 to 12 range. But when you get off of the tops of these ridges, it's probably in the 12 to 20 range. So conclusion is that if you pasture, you can probably save some soil, save phosphorus loss, and reduce nitrogen in the groundwater. They sort of two premier grazing systems it's practiced in the state of Wisconsin that would drive to that is grass-fed dairy, grass milk, as Organic Valley calls it, or grass-fed beef production. Why grass-fed beef production? You can't be in this business and make any money at all if you don't practice managed grazing. And regardless of how good you are at extending the season of grazing, you're going to have to use grass and legume hay, and that has to be produced someplace. So from a conservation standpoint, this looks like a winner. But the real question that producers have is, okay, you guys, I can save my soil, but can I make any money at it? Or put another way, is grass-fed beef production economically sustainable? And now we're getting to the meat of the conversation. So to answer that question, the National Fish and Wildlife Federation and Trout Unlimited ponied up some money to have me run around to as many farms as I could that were in grass-fed beef production and look at their financials. A daunting task because I wanted to strip out all of the financial planning numbers and finances that were not directly related to the grass-fed beef operation. But we had three goals of this study: benchmark the financial returns of actual farms doing grass-fed beef, develop a tool to capture that data, but also to help producers understand where they're making money, what decisions they have made that help them make money, and what decisions don't. Identify some good profit management methods that are being used on the farms that I got onto. That was a goal of the study. It was conducted in the driftless area because Trout Unlimited is very concerned about the streams here, so is the National Wildlife Federation. But it's also where there's a lot of grass-fed beef producers. Farms are small. They were small dairy farms. As dairy went out, this is the sort of an epicenter of the egregious erosion events that I took pictures of. So what about these farms? Well, I I actually reached out to about 40 farms. I boiled that down to 20 that I actually got on to. 5 of those, the number, either they were in a very initial startup phase and really didn't have any meaningful numbers, or they just really were bad at keeping records and I couldn't get much. I ended up with about 15 farms that had fairly good records. All of them used managed grazing. All of them mainly owned most of their land. Some of them rented some land. The size of the farms went from selling 6 finished beef a year to 150, average about 40. All of them had some modicum of previous animal husbandry experience. Some were really good at it. All in the driftless area I mentioned, all of them had other sources of, and most, if pressed, would point to some feel about conservation of soil being one of the reasons that they entered into this production. The analytical tool that we used was developed in parallel to a development of something called the Livestock Compass, which resides currently along with other similar compasses. One's for vegetables, the other is for organic grain, and this is for livestock, from beef all the way to chickens and eggs, and everything in between resides at the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems at the university. John Hendrickson is sort of the keeper, not sort of, he is the keeper, he is the compass master, if you will. You can Google this to find it. I didn't put the web page up. The www.veggiecompass.com will get you there. What this tool does, and it's free, you can get it off the internet, it shows profitability for each of the livestock types that are grown on a farm, and profitability for each of the channels of distribution, whether you sell directly to consumers or whether you sell to an intermediary that then sells to retail. It accounts for actual expenditures in the year just preceding, including all the overhead costs. It also looks at the cost of major components that build up the final cost of the final product. So the cost of a calf, the cost of a lamb, the cost to get a pullet into production for laying an egg, so that you can make decisions. The whole object here is for the farmer to be able to look back at what they've done the year before and make decisions that will help them be more profitable in the future. The other thing that was very important in this operation, or in this exercise, was to be able to adjust for inventory changes. Now, what that means in plain talk is that a lot of the farms I talked to were in the process of building their herds. So you have to account for the fact that they're putting money into something they're not going to sell, but keep as an asset to make money in the future, number one. And number two, it takes 2 years from the time a calf drops on the ground until you can sell it in a grass-fed system to make income on costs that you have in the previous year. So you have to adjust for inventory. Bottom line is this, and then we'll get into some detail, that of these 15 farms, the lowest 1/3 of them made $60 roughly per acre return on their operation. The middle third made a bit over $100, and the top third made $220 an acre return on the land used for that operation. The average was $135 an acre. There was no land cost except rent. I'm sorry, except taxes. This is not rented land, this is owned land. There was no depreciation. And the reason for that is that depreciation is used by tax preparers as a way to shield income, and is not economically correct. So I just took it out. No owner living costs is involved. No labor and management costs is involved. And this was to make a level playing field, and not have people try to guess how much their labor is worth. It has full overhead burden. That is, if you bought screws and put them in a box in your shop, you bought something, that becomes overhead. That is included in these costs. I can tell you that a few of the people I talked to, of the 40 people I originally talked to, some of them bragged that they were making $300 an acre, but I couldn't get numbers from them, and so they weren't included. And so it really puts in question, puts in question whether they were really doing that or not in a rigorous accounting system. If you look at corn and beans, and the data set here comes from the University of Minnesota FinBin, also in 2018, about 400 farms provide numbers for this data set. Again, no land cost, no labor and I stripped out land cost, labor and management, and no depreciation with respect to the cash, the red line up above. If you strip out those, the returns on average were $143. And this is kind of a key number. If you go to a neighbor and say, how much did you make on the beans, on your beans last year? They can usually tell you, oh, I made $120. Because they know input costs, and they know how much yield, and well, they know how much they made selling. So that's kind of an easy number to talk to farmers about. If you put depreciation in this, and this is not tax depreciation, but actual economic depreciation, the returns drop, of course, and that's the blue line. And the average of that is $97. So just from what you see right now, without some modifiers I'll talk about, the returns on the average of these 16 farms was right in the ballpark of what a grain rotation would give you in 2018. But there are some modifiers to that. Land quality is a modifier. A lot of the land on the farms that I visited was highly erodible, and would have provided low grain yields than was in the data set from FinBin. I could not translate that into return, so it's just an interesting modifier, but it would be in favor of converting the land to pasture. Very notably, about 20% of the land on these grass-fed beef farms is arguably not suitable for grain production at all. Now, there's a little slippery slope, pardon the pun, between low yielding, highly erodible land and totally not suitable. That slippery slope is in the eye of the landowner. And so we have the case in the driftless area where landowners, to get more rent, have pushed off ridges into land that was not cropped when they were in the dairy business. And the yields on that land are very low. And the erosion is very high. Another modifier is assets. I had very poor data either from FinBin or from the farms I went on to about what their asset base was. But observationally, if you just took a look around at what they were using for equipment, these grass-fed farms had a much lower asset base than per acre even than the grain farms. There was one farm that was selling 80 or 90 head a year, and their equipment consisted of one 60 horsepower tractor, a vintage 60 horsepower tractor, a brush hog, and a manure spreader. They rented their skid steer when they needed it. They had a neighbor do their hay when they needed it. And actually they bought most of their hay. So it was all over the map. People who migrated from dairy to grass-fed beef came with a lot of iron. And so unneeded iron. Labor, incomplete data here. When you talk to people about how much time they spend, they really have to scratch their head. But generally speaking, I did a little triangulation. Grass-fed beef farmers are probably spending twice as much per acre as a grain farmer. Grain farmers, of course, it isn't always on the land that they're spending time. They're fixing stuff and doing other things. But grass-fed beef farmers are working probably every day moving cattle. So those are some modifiers. Now, let's dive down below the return per acre into the cost structure of some of these farms. Profit or net profit is a result of revenue, which is driven by the pounds of beef you sell and what you sell it for. That's revenue minus expenses. So let's take one slide here of revenue of these 15 farms, 16 farms. This is the revenue that those are the price per pound of carcass. That is an animal that has been killed, skinned, prepared for making into meat. In the industry, we call it hot carcass weight. The average price received 2018 by these 15 farms was $2.86 a pound of hung weight. That year, conventional beef was going for $1.95. The grass-fed guys were getting, from this study, about a 45% premium. One of the tricks that these fellows and gals were doing is selling multiple products. Sometimes if the price for calves was up, they would sell calves rather than finish them themselves. Sometimes, for instance, there was one farm where somebody from Minneapolis came along and said he wanted barley finished beef, and so the young man and his dad decided to take 5 beef out of the grass-fed system and chuck them full of barley and sold them at a considerable amount of money to this fellow from Minneapolis who wanted barley-fed beef. There was only one farm, however, that was totally into direct marketing. The majority of them were into a combination of all these other ways of selling and selling to what I call an intermediary. An intermediary is somebody that buys the animal off the farm. You do no marketing. They take the animal directly to a slaughter facility and process it into meat that then they sell. That's the intermediary's job. In Wisconsin, we're lucky. There's probably a half a dozen of people who do this on a regular, who are intermediaries and will buy on a regular basis. One of the things that I explored, not just in 2018, but generally, price stability. The conventional market has quite a bit of instability as it balances supply and demand. Grass-fed beef tends to be fairly stably priced. An interesting thing is that getting a high price didn't always mean having high profit. That's a statement about people's management capability. Okay, now let's look at cost. If you just look all the way to the end, what did it cost a grass-fed beef producer to sell, to produce an animal ready for sale on the same basis as we looked at price, that is dollars per pound of hot carcass weight. The average from this study was $2.20. During 2018, if I backed into a number, this is a hard number to find, this conventional number, but I backed into it using FinBin data. It's probably in the order of $1.69 to $1.75 a pound. Therefore, comparing grass-fed to conventional, there's a disadvantage for grass-fed producers on the order of 30%. Yeah, conventional price was an approximation that I used. If you look at this, at the spread from the low 1/3, the low cost to the high cost, there's quite a spread. This is very typical in agriculture. If you look at FinBin information for the 160 people, 180 people who give, for instance, cow-calf data to the University of Minnesota, you'll find an even greater disparity between the lowest 20% and the highest 20%, and they are notched off in 20% increments. What this tells you is that, yes, there may be unique things about the farm that can produce a pound of beef for $1.50, topography, soils, stage of the development of the managed pasture, etc. But the biggest determinant between low and high is the management of the operators. And this is good news, because what it says is that those who have a high cost of production could be taught or could learn how to produce at a lower rate. We had one outlier that's in this top 1/3 whose cost was $4.40. And so we dove into why that was. And the reason it was is in that particular year, his calf crop was like 60% of the number of cows exposed to be bred, or the year before. And so he was having a lot of input cost, but not getting a lot of meat out of that input cost. Okay, so marching ahead, that's cost at the high level. For those not in the beef industry, the cost of that weaned calf in general is about half of the cost of a finished beef. In the grass-fed study, it was very interesting. The cost of a weaned calf of the 15 farms was $625. And that calf, we estimated, because not a lot of these folks weigh them, but we estimated that they were weaning off about a 550 to 600 pound calf. That happens to be almost exactly the weight of the calves of farms reporting to FinBin. And so to make the same calf in conventional cow-calf production, we're looking at a total cost of maybe $60 higher than the 15 farms in this study. One of the reasons for that is if you look at the cost of feed per cow in the herd, it is $120, almost $120 less for the grass-fed beef producer than it is for the conventional producer. If the weaning rate is the same, if the weight of the animal is the same, you could say, therefore, that you should see $100 difference, lower total cost of the weaned calf. But now we get into the skill of the people that were in this study, and on there, it's only 15 farms, and a lot of them were just ramping up production. So they lost a little bit, but still, they were better than the average of the 180 farms that reported to FinBin. That's a big deal, because it doesn't it implies that even conventional cow-calf producers, if they followed the same methods that the grass-fed producers use in making calves, they could be more competitive in the conventional market. Why is it more competitive? Well, cost difference is driven by a lower cost of feed. In the beef industry and in many animal agricultural activities, we say that the cost of feed is something around 60% of the total cost of producing an animal. If, therefore, you focus on the cost of feed, if you can lower the cost of feed, it has a leveraged effect on the cost of the animal. So lower, and in this system, the grass-fed system, the lower cost of feed is driven by a lower cost of pasture. Actually, the lower cost of dry matter off pasture. I should have written that a little differently. And in fact, on these farms, the cost of a ton of dry matter of fairly high quality off managed pasture was $20. The cost of harvested forage of a similar quality was $82 on these farms. What I didn't put up here is some of these farms bought hay, and that, as I remember, was on average, and I can't speak to the quality of that hay, but on average, there was about $115 to $120 a ton in that 2018 year period, or 2018 period. So there are implications for conventional producers. If you can lower the cost of producing a calf by implementing and maximizing managed grazing as a feed source. Let's think about maximizing a minute. Maximizing means extending the grazing season. Maximizing means pasture management that maximizes yield. If you can learn to do those two things, you can get actually better than this $20. The 15 farms in this study, some people were way up on the learning curve and were really excellent at managing pasture, extending it, increasing yield. But some were just beginning to learn this. And so 20 is the average. A key component is a key cost component is the cost of the calf. And here again, if you look at the high cost versus the low cost, there's a tremendous difference. And this is driven by both scale of the operation, but mainly the skill of the operator. So this is good news, because if you can change skill levels and you can change scale, and so you can drive costs down by being smarter, which to me is an elegant thing in life. So low and medium cost, the other thing that this tells you is that the low and medium cost people in this study in 2018 could have sold calves on the conventional market and made money. The conventional market in 2018 was $1.54 a pound of live weight of calf. And if you look at the average weight of the calf that was in the fin bin, I think it was 560 or something like that, 570. I don't know, you could do the math in reverse, but it's about $862. If you look up here at the chart, the middle guys were at about less than 580 and change, and the low cost guys were but someplace between $300 and $400 a calf. That's not chump change. That, so if you can, if you bear down on cost, production and utilization of pasture, you can drive these costs down and be competitive on the conventional market. So the implication here is that any cow-calf producer that follows these methods can become more competitive. So now that gets us a calf. The other half of the cost of a finished animal, excuse me, is finishing the animal, taking it from after weaning and raising it up to whatever size that you sell at. Size is not the determinant. The determinant is finish. It's how much fat is in the meat. So grass-fed beef, if you recall, I said that the average cost of a finished grass-fed beef was what, $220, I think it was, something like that, was higher by 30% from the conventional. Right here is the reason for that. The calf is cheaper, but the finishing is a good deal more expensive. And it's more expensive because it takes longer to finish an animal on grass than it takes in a conventional system. And we'll talk about the conventional system here. Well, we'll do it right now. The last bullet point is grass-fed. The grass-fed market requires an animal treatment protocol that not only calls for all grass and grass forage to be the diet, but growth promotants are not allowed. No grain is allowed. Growth promotants and grain are what makes conventional beef finish quickly. So if you take those out, you have an animal that is going to gain more naturally. If anybody's ever traveled and eaten beef in Europe, it used to be, back when I was young, that all beef in Europe was grass finished, and it was all 2.5 to 3 years old. And it was delicious because of the method it was raised. Anyway, that's a little promotional side point for grass-fed beef. Anyway, slower rate of gain. Pasture and harvested forage are wonderful feeds, but they're low on what we call energy, digestible carbohydrates. And that's what puts fat on animals, and quickly. The other thing is that the grass-fed beef, purveyors of grass-fed beef, or the raisers of grass-fed beef, are using genetics that tend to marble quickly. That tends to be smaller animals. And so the finished product, that carcass, is on average in this study was 605 pounds. During 2018, the average conventional carcass was 842 pounds. That 605-pound carcass took close to 2 years to raise. That 842-pound carcass in a conventional system took about 16, 17 months to raise. So that's the reason for the cost to finish being higher in a grass-fed system. So what were the best practices that I saw in these farms that helped them, the ones that were making the most money per acre, the ones that had the lowest cost of calves, the ones that finished for the least amount of money? These are the practices that I identified people talking about and observed. They started with the right kind of cattle, English breeds that were little smaller framed animals, And I don't want to get into a discussion of genetics because this is almost as fractious as having a discussion about which grass is best. It's just one of these things that's almost like politics and religion. Anyway, managed intensive grazing. The people who did the best really understood grazing as a way to stimulate the best growth out of their pastures. They increased yields without adding cost. All they'd added was management. This drives yield. The cost of any agricultural product is a division of the yield that you get divided by the input cost to get it. The beauty of managed intensive grazing is that you can increase yields without opening your checkbook. You can increase yields by being smart. They all used, with their finishing animals in particular, very short occupancy times on the paddock. Most of them followed the rule of thumb is take half, leave half. All of them had some degree of extended grazing season. I didn't put it here, but they did exactly what the Breneman farm does, and many of us do, and that is that we outwinter our cattle, feed them on paddocks, which brings nutrients onto the paddock. They match. This is kind of an interesting thing that applies also to conventional. In Wisconsin, I have seen producers new to the beef industry tend to overfeed their cattle. I think it comes from a dairy background, or just, the environment around us raises very good forage. You don't need really good forage for a dry beef cow. And quality and cost go hand in hand. You can buy lower quality, sufficient quality to keep a cow going and not losing for low cost. Some of them purchased hay and they had deals with neighbors to perpetually buy hay from that neighbor at a fairly good price. And then they converted land that on their own farm that would have been hay land into pasture. Keep machinery investment low. There's one fellow that I mentioned before who actually was the exemplar in this. But generally speaking, unless you come to this with a whole bunch of equipment, it's best to keep it very low. Use custom operators to use somebody else's iron to make your hay, to haul your manure, to what have you. Rent machinery instead of buying it. Nutrient management. If you look at the university cost sheets for pasture, for any crop, but let's talk pasture and hay. Pasture, the number one expense, if you account for it, is the fact that you own a piece of land. Because theoretically, you could do other things with that money if you didn't own the land. But putting that aside, the second biggest expense is nutrients. If you can use natural nutrients, that is manure, that is hay that you've bought from somebody else, feed it to your animals on the pasture, they deposit manure and urine on the pasture, that is what I call nutrient management. If you do build a bedding pack in the winter to keep your animals off the ground, do something with that bedding pack. And finally, know your cost data and how to use it to make good profit decisions. One of the most profitable farms in the 15 well, there's 2 or 3 examples. When I asked for numbers, they gave them to me. They had them. Operator skills is extremely important. Here's the skill set that I found in the exemplars, the ones that were the best: bovine animal husbandry, forage, agronomy, pasture management, big deal. Business management. Even if you're selling beef to an intermediary, you should spend time on raising price through different ways of marketing. There are intermediaries that will offer more money in certain times of the year because they need cattle. Understand that. On cost, get data and information about your cost structure and learn how to change cost by things like buying hay when it's cheap, or selling cattle when somebody's willing to offer you a lot of money for an animal that's not finished yet. But most importantly, if you're going to be in this business, it is a business of things between the ears. And so constant learning is one of the things that make you successful. So what does it look like going forward? Well, question, is grass-fed beef a flash in the pan? Not in the medium term. We see a continual 10 to 15% demand growth. There's a limited supply of American beef. Now, the interesting thing is the grass-fed beef market is getting to be a high single-digit, almost a double-digit percent of the whole beef industry. American producers can't keep up, and so about 80% of the grass-fed beef in the United States comes from someplace else, some other country. So that is an issue that the grass-fed beef market has in front of it, but it is an advantage for people selling locally, because you can tout the fact that the grass-fed beef you are selling is raised in Wisconsin or in the upper Midwest or in the United States for that matter. We're very lucky in grass-fed beef. We have industry downstream infrastructure. We have cattle haulers. We have 200 meat processors in the Wisconsin Association of Meat Processors, and probably another 100 sticking around here and there. Although right now they're all backed up because everybody wanted local beef. Anyway, we have a lot of them. And we have, in certain parts of Wisconsin, we have mass. And by that I mean, here in Vernon County, where I am, within a 10-mile range, there's probably 4 or 5 people that I can buy calves from, that I can sell calves to, people that I know that are in the industry. I can ask them questions. How are you doing this? How are you doing that? Can I use your no-till drill? Well, pay for it, but use it. Mass is important. There are places in the middle of the state where people in your organization have done a tremendous job of promoting grazing. So you have mass in that area as well. Okay. Conventional beef industry. That was an offshoot of this study. I found a lot of things that are very important to the 21,000 beef producers we have in Wisconsin. In the year 2017, we had only about 8,500 dairy producers. Although we're the dairy state, we had 21,000 beef producers in Wisconsin. We had a lot more dairy cows than we had beef cows, but we all know they were concentrated in places in operations that don't graze, and while they use forage, so it's like the Breneman farm. The soil implications are that the dairy rotation is better than the crop rotation on that farm. So these big large dairy operations do have that going for them from a conservation standpoint, but they don't graze. So the other thing we've got going as the reason we're a dairy state, one of the reasons, is we have great soils and water that grow fantastic grass. And that supports especially the cow-calf part of the beef industry. Okay, grass in a managed grazing system equals cost advantages for cow-calf operations and for stockers. Stockers are taking a weaned calf and growing them big enough to put into a feedlot. And we've got, between Vernon and Crawford County, we've got one operation that runs 6,000 stockers a year. That is something that we could do a lot more of in parts of Wisconsin. And we have industry production infrastructure for beef. We've got veterinarians, we have cattle haulers, we have feed mills, still have feed mills sticking around all over the Wisconsin. We have sellers of seed for pastures who have no-till drills. We've got a lot of stuff going for us to become actually a bigger beef producer as we move the number of farms away from dairy. And we have a good educational establishment that's kind of a hangover from the dairy industry. We've University of Wisconsin and all of the satellite universities that I don't know whether that's the right word for them, but the Platteville's and others, one of them, Menominee, let's see, forget the name of it, are an extension, are great educational establishments. So anyway, is this use of land economically sustainable? Yes, it is. And especially as you look at more marginal land like we have on our place. And so all of you land and water conservation people who are promoting grazing, you're doing exactly the right thing for the soil and the water and for the producers. And so if you can use some of this information to convince a producer to change from a crop system. And by the way, in the Tainter Creek watershed, I've done a little work with them, and we've only been at it a year. They've been at it a year, and we've got 2 beef producers who were producing. They were in the cow-calf business, who have decided it's really smart for them to take some of their steeper land out of crop production and turn it into pasture. And it's really smart. One of them has decided it's really smart on his more flat land to fence it off and to put cover crops in and graze the cover crops. So those are big wins. In fact, I can tell you that on one farm, we're saving, theoretically, with Russell too, we're saving 300 tons of soil per year. And that's a big deal. So we'll go to any questions that might have trickled in.
Okay, we have a few. So anyone that has questions, you can send them through the chat box, type them in, and then we'll address them, or we will unmute. You can unmute yourself after we get done with these. So the first one was, and that came in earlier, did you ever consider stocker grazing as an option? Like Reed Ludlow, Larry Smith?
Right.
And
yes, and Reed Ludlow is exactly the guy that grazes 6,000 head a year. And yes, it can be a very viable business option. However, the key to that business is being able to source at a good price the young stockers coming onto the farm and being able to market them at a good price on the other end. The former is more important than the latter. There is a market for animals going into feedlots. Sourcing those cattle at scale is a big deal. Now, there are people in Wisconsin who will do that service for you. and I ran into one down by Muscadet that was associated with one of the farms I was talking to. So yes, it is a viable business option.
And the second part of that, I don't know if this was covered, but and would it compare with grass finished cattle?
I'm sorry, say that again.
He's so this is. Did you ever consider stocker grazing as an option, like the Reed Lulo?
Yeah.
And how would you compare it with grass finished cattle?
Two of the farms in my little study did not raise calves, and and they were not in the high profitability range because basically they were. If you think of the cost structure that I talked about before, if the cow-calf people do have an advantage of being able to raise a calf at a lower cost than a conventional calf. There's ways to, for people who raise cow-calves, a cow-calf in a grass-fed system and sell them to grass-fed finisher, you would expect that they would be able to sell at a premium. But in practice, the people who are buying calves are very stingy about it. And so not combining cow-calf with finishing is a challenge, but it can be done. In other words, the two farms I'm thinking of, while they weren't the highest profit, they were buying calves from somebody else and grass finishing themselves. Comparing that to stockers, I don't have the stocker numbers. Larry's think about these numbers, but I haven't done it recently. So I can't answer the question of the comparison.
Okay, and then that was a question from Gene and Schreifer, if I'm saying that right, Schreifer.
Yep.
Then he made a comment, labor is an overhead cost. Doubling from 50 to 100 cows does not double labor costs, so reduce labor costs per head. The main issue is one of scale.
That's exactly right. It's, if you've got so increasing from 50 to 100 is a land issue, not a labor issue. You just make the paddocks bigger. You might have to, if you're breeding cattle, you've probably got to add some bulls to the operation, but generally speaking, that's exactly right. With respect to labor. And that's the reason on this stocker farm we were talking about, they run these 6,000 stockers with an owner and 2 employees and about 6 good border collies.
Okay.
So,
well, good. Another question, is there a profitability advantage, must be a Monday, or disadvantages for a producer that only finishes calves, does not have a cow-calf operation? So did you get that?
yeah, and that was the two that were in the study. The challenge there is that the cost of the finished grass-fed beef tends to be in the finishing phase. If you can buy calves right, and by right I mean the right kind of calf at a reasonable price, and if you're smart about pasture management and about making high quality forage for those times when you can't be on pasture, it is a proposition to buy your calves and to finish it. The way to do that is actually not one of the farms in this study, but a farm I know very well down in the southern part of Wisconsin. Right, well, actually, she's in most of her farm is in Illinois. She got so big that she couldn't produce enough animals. And so what she did was she got a neighbor to convert from row crops to pasture, and she put most of her mother cows, well, it's a combination of owning them and putting them on that farm, and then eventually that farmer owned the mother cows, and she reverted to only a finishing farm. But what that did for her was it kept a very consistent animal coming into her finishing operation, because they were actually her genetics that had been transferred to this other farm. And she helped this other farmer ongoing to keep the genetics in the window that she needed to finish and to meet the value proposition that she had out there as a direct marketer.
Okay, here's one more. You indicate that MIG is cost-free. However, isn't there a fencing cost to intensively graze?
Absolutely. So there's two kinds of costs, and it isn't free. I must have misspoken. It on average, ongoing, it costs $20 per ton of dry matter taken off the farms that off pastures on the farms that I referred to. And yes, there was an upfront fence cost. And Gene Schrieffer and I have been to some of these meetings where NRCS is under all kinds of pressure to make equip better so that the fencing is cheaper and so forth. And at one of those, I made the observation that in the grand scheme of things, even high quality fencing, and I do not have high quality fencing, even high quality fencing and a water system, in the grand scheme of things, is a lot less than you would pay for equipment. So if you don't buy equipment, you have the money you could put in the fence yourself. But the equip program is brilliant, because if you're willing to take the time to make the application, get your application approved and so forth, and one, let's see, five of the farms that I was on had used equip to do all their fencing. And so their cost of fencing was almost nothing. The $20 per ton of dry matter taken off the field, that $20, if you take 3 tons of dry matter off per acre, 20 times 3 is $60 per acre, ongoing cost. What is that for? That is for maintenance of fencing and water system. That is for seed that you might frost seed to get the legume content up, to get nitrogen into your pastures. That is clipping. That is everything you do to maintain that pasture, $60 an acre. If you get only 1 ton of dry matter off of that acre, then the cost per ton of dry matter is $60. If you are clever enough to get 3 tons of dry matter off of that paddock or off that piece of land, the cost is $20, which is what the average was of the farms that were in this study. The reason I said you can get, the comment I made was that if you start out with spending $60 an acre ongoing to maintain a paddock, and you only get a ton of dry matter off, if you're smarter, you don't spend any more money and you can get 3 tons off. And so the cost of forage goes from $60 a ton to $20 a ton. That's what I was trying to get across.
Thanks. There are no more questions in the chat box. So does anyone want to mute yourself and ask Jim some questions directly? Go ahead.
So I have an email address. If anybody does have any more questions, it's get your pencils out, jmunch@mwt.net. mwt.net. And be glad to answer anything directly.
Great. And I just put that in the chat box too and sent that out to people. Great.
I was not technically capable of doing that, I guess.
That's okay. That's not your job. That's what I'm here for. I got to do a little something. And then there was another question. When are you doing a seminar on how to increase tons per acre?
Well, actually, there are people on this call that might be more qualified to do that than I am, but we could, and you know, Gene Schriefer is my go-to source of these things. Incidentally, I don't know what Grassworks is doing this year, but the where I learned to do a lot of this was Grassworks and pasture walks. And you know, the pasture walks in Wisconsin, in certain parts of Wisconsin, are just phenomenal. The guys up in the middle of the state that run these pasture walks get really good speakers to come in and address all aspects of that question. How do you increase yield on pasture? How do you increase quality on pasture? How do you extend the grazing season? So there are a lot of sources, and I encourage anybody interested to get on these mailing lists. And I think there is the Grassworks puts out a master list of all these pasture walks. And not only do you see what's going on that farm, but you're with other people who are struggling with the same issues on their farm. So,
are there any other questions? Otherwise, we're probably going to end it for today. Well, thanks so much, Jim. It's always good to have some positive news and all that research that you've done. So greatly appreciate it. And looking forward to maybe hearing from some of you other ones again in the future. Okay, take care, everyone. Stay well. Have a great day.